Welcome. My name is James Brohl. I am a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us here at the Capitol Visitor Center for our event, Powering AI, Navigating Energy Challenges and Overregulation. If you don't know CEI, we're a nonprofit public policy think tank focused on promoting free enterprise, limited government, and individual liberty. Today's event is about the interplay between artificial intelligence and energy policy. So AI, from large language models to advanced machine learning applications, is reshaping the economy. And at the same time, this growth is translating into ever-increasing demand for reliable, affordable power, especially for the data centers that keep AI systems running. To shed light on these issues, my colleague Paige Lambermont and I have just released a new report, Powering Intelligence, Meeting AI's Energy Needs in a Changing Electricity Landscape. You should have a copy of that report on your seats. We examine how AI-driven energy consumption intersects with issues like grid reliability and permitting reform, and offer recommendations for ensuring market-driven electricity generation continues going forward. I should also mention CEI has recently released a book on EPA reform called Modernizing the EPA. We don't have copies of that here, but it's available for free on our website, cei.org, where we offer a guide for congressional staffers and anyone else who's interested in how to overhaul nearly every aspect of one of the biggest regulatory agencies in Washington. We're also extremely honored to have Representative Jay Obernolte here. He was the chairman of the House AI Task Force and is someone with a very distinguished background in both computer science and public service and entrepreneurship. And he brings really unique insights into how Congress can help foster AI innovation and ensure our nation's energy challenges are met. We're going to begin today with Representative Obernolte sharing his perspective on these issues. Then we'll open the floor to some Q&A after that. And he can stick around for a panel where we have after that if he has time, but he may have to depart. The panel will include Paige Lambermont of CEI and Travis Fisher of the Cato Institute. So again, thank you all for being here. And with that, I'm delighted to turn things over to Representative Obernolte. Thank you.
Thanks. Wow, thanks very much, everyone. It's an honor to be here today to talk about my favorite subject, which is artificial intelligence. It was an honor for me to lead the House AI Task Force last year. As I hope everyone is aware, that was a group of 24 members of Congress, evenly divided between 12 Republicans and 12 Democrats. And our stated goal was by the end of the year to deliver a report proposing a federal regulatory framework for AI. So we had 25 different hearings. We heard from over 100 different witnesses, conducted a bunch of roundtables, and delivered in December a report that I'm deeply proud of. It almost 270 pages long, and it makes over 60 key findings and 85 different concrete policy recommendations on AI. So that report, the way we view it is, that was the end of the planning phase, and now it's time to move into the implementation phase. And we specifically designed the recommendations in the report to be used as a checklist for future Congresses, starting with this one. And we think that if this Congress and future Congresses were to enact all of those 85 different recommendations, that would do the job of creating a comprehensive federal regulatory framework for AI. I'll tell you a couple of things that I'm particularly proud of. First is the fact that we were able to keep this a bipartisan process throughout. I was one of the people who was advocating strongly for the task force to be completely bipartisan. What I asked the Speaker is not to follow the standard practice of putting more members of the majority than the minority on the task force, because I thought with the dynamics in the House and the Senate right now, anything that we do that's durable is going to have to be bipartisan anyway. And so why not just embrace that from the start? And it was very successful. We felt like a team throughout. And in fact, when we had our hearings, I eschewed the usual practice as a chair of seating people, Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other, and seating people by seniority. And what I told all my members is sit wherever you want. In fact, what I would like you to do is sit somewhere different every time so you get to know different members of our task force and maybe form some relationships with people that you don't know as well as you could. And by the end of it, we all knew each other very well, and we really felt like a team. And what it highlights is the fact that AI regulation is not a partisan issue. There's lots that we can all agree on that needs to be done. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of is that the task force report was unanimously approved by all 24 members of the task force, and by the speaker and his staff, and by the minority leader and his staff. So we only put things in the report that everyone could agree on. There was a lot more that we could have talked about that there was not unanimous agreement on, and that we just chose not to talk about that because there was no need to. We could focus on all the things that we could all agree on. So this makes me really optimistic that the way is paved for us to actually implement this into law this year. Because if we can all agree on what needs to be done, I know that getting into the nitty-gritty of language of legislation is oftentimes a little bit more difficult, but I'm convinced, based on our success last year, that we're well positioned to do it. So if you haven't read our report, please download it. Just read the executive summary if you'd like. We tried to be thoughtful and just make it a couple of pages to summarize at a high level the things that we're recommending. But to summarize the summary for you, what we are recommending is a rejection of the approach that Europe has taken, where they have centralized the administration of artificial intelligence regulation, spun up a brand new bureaucracy to deal with it, and created a near universal licensing requirement for anything but the lowest risks of AI. So in other words, if you're in Europe and you're going to use AI, you have to deal with several different regulators. You have to deal with the regulator in your sectoral space, and you have to deal with a brand new regulator that just regulates your use of AI. We don't think that that's a good fit for the American system. We think we need to embrace our existing system of sectoral regulation. And the reason for that is if you read the risk management framework that NIST put out last year, which has been acknowledged as pretty much the furthest thinking document on risk analysis for AI that's been done anywhere in the world, and many countries have now adopted it. If you read that document, you'll find that what NIST says is that the risks of AI deployment are highly contextual, meaning that it matters very much what you're going to do with that AI when you determine what the risks of deploying the AI in that context are. So something that is unacceptably risky in one usage context, like in a medical device, for example, or in a highly consequential decision-making process, might be completely benign in another usage context. Exactly the same algorithm, but in different usages, different risks. And we think that that's absolutely right. And that's why our sectoral regulators have the knowledge about the risks in their sectoral spaces to factor in the risks of AI when they're making regulatory decisions. And a good example, we're already having to navigate this. A good example is the one I just used, medical devices. The FDA regulates medical devices, obviously. They have already issued over 1,000 permits for the use of AI in medical devices, which is pretty much the highest risk usage context you could think of. Really, maybe an autonomous weapon or something might be higher risk, but in a medical device, you definitely want someone to be paying attention to what AI is doing and how it's doing it and how it was trained and what the risks of failures like hallucinations might be. So the FDA, though, is already having to navigate this, and by the reports of almost all the stakeholders we talk to across the stakeholder spectrum, they're doing a pretty solid job of regulating within that space. So what we are saying in the report is that is a model that's going to work for the United States. We certainly need to equip regulators like the FDA with the tools and the knowledge and the resources that they need to do their jobs. And so we have some specific recommendations on how to do that, how to create pools of technical talent that can be harnessed by sectoral regulators. We need to create a regulatory toolbox of different testing and evaluation methodologies that are available for regulators to pick up and use. We need to create regulatory sandboxes for the testing of potentially malicious AI, and basically give our sectoral regulators all of these tools that they can use so they don't have to duplicate the effort across the federal regulatory spectrum. But at the end of the day, we think it's much easier to teach the FDA what it might not already know about AI than it would be to teach a brand new regulator everything the FDA has learned over decades of regulating patient safety. And we think that's true not just of the FDA, but NHTSA's regulation of AI in autonomous vehicles, FAA's regulation of AI in avionics, and so on and so forth. So we think that those 85 recommendations, if we implement those, will set the framework for doing that. So now we need to move into the implementation phase. And I want to end here with a sense of urgency, because things have transpired that make this a much more pressing issue for this Congress to deal with this year. And the main problem that we're having, in addition to the need to create these tools and this framework, is the actions of the states. The states have gotten very impatient with the federal government. There is a lack of confidence that Congress is capable of acting on this issue, and so the states are regulating on their own. So everyone saw probably last year, the state of Colorado passed a very far-reaching bill on AI regulation that presumes a lot of authority that should be federal in nature because of the way that they regulate interstate commerce. And the governor of Colorado even said in his signing message, I don't think this is something states ought to be doing. But because I have no faith that Congress is going to do it, and he should know as a former member of Congress, he said, I'm going to implement this with a delayed implementation date of February 2026. So February 2026, if Congress does not act, that will become state law in Colorado. California, I think everyone's aware of the really, really far-reaching bill and what many would call a very destructive bill that was introduced, passed by both chambers of the legislature and vetoed by Governor Gavin Newsom last fall. That bill 2 weeks ago was reintroduced with some changes that the author hopes will lead to the governor signing the bill when he gets it through the legislature this year, and that would be implemented January 1st of next year. So all of this creates a landscape where it's clear Congress either needs to act or admit that we're not going to act. So we have this year to do it. And we need to make it clear to the states what the guardrails are. We need to make it clear under our system of federalism what we are preempting and reserving for federal action. In other words, what is so clearly related to interstate commerce that we are saying Congress is going to regulate this part. And then outside those guardrails, we need to say to the states, you states go be the laboratories of democracy you are, and you are free to regulate outside these guardrails. But that needs to be done very soon. And the other point I make to people say, well, why don't you just do preemption, the preemption piece, or why don't you do a moratorium? Well, my counter to that is you can't preempt something with nothing. We have to make it clear to the states, not only that Congress is going to act in this space, but we are capable of acting and that we have acted in this space. And so I feel like we really need to do this all at once. So we have been in talks with our colleagues in the Senate and in the White House. I was delighted to see that Michael Kratsios was confirmed as head of OSTP yesterday. So that's going to be an important ally for us. We've been talking with David Sachs, who's the new AI czar, Saram Krishnan, who is the special advisor to the president on AI. What we all need to do is sit down, agree on what the path is, and then start pushing all in the same direction. If we can do that, I am cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to get this across the finish line this year. And so this is what we're going to try to do. So I want to thank you very much for engaging on this topic, and thanks for the honor of being here today.
Thank you. All right, so now we will turn to our panel discussion. Before we begin, I thought maybe I'd start by just highlighting some of the statistics that come from our report, which we survey some of the estimates as to where we're going as far as the electricity demand from AI. I mean, right now we're seeing unprecedented investments in infrastructure for AI systems. You probably saw in the news this $500 billion investment program called Stargate. According to different estimates, data centers could account up to 8 to 9% of total U.S. electricity demand by 2030, which is just 5 years from now, and that's nearly double the share from just a few years ago. However, there's also a lot of uncertainty in this area, and I think that it's worth highlighting that uncertainty. Open source models are one source of uncertainty. So we've seen breakthroughs from, there's Meta's Llama model, then there's also this Chinese DeepSeek R1 model, which came out recently, which the company DeepSeek claims to have produced a cutting-edge AI model at a fraction of the cost of some of the leading US models. There's some debate about how true those cost estimates are, but even if there's some truth to it, then that casts doubt on some of these, whether these big investments in AI are going to pay off. And that in turn casts doubt about some of the electricity demand in the future. Similarly, the R1 model may have relied on intellectual property from OpenAI. And if foreign competitors can replicate or even surpass some of our breakthroughs in AI, this undermines some of the incentives to, again, invest in large-scale AI infrastructure. Now, I think it's the case that probably frontier AI labs are always going to continue to require extraordinary energy resources, but some of these IP and open source issues could slow the pace of that investment. And so what I think all of this leads to is a conclusion that we need a flexible energy policy and market-driven, importantly, energy strategy that allows adequate energy supply to come online to meet energy demand, whatever that may end up being, whether it's at the high end of some of the estimates or at the low end. So with that background in mind, I will turn to our panelists. So again, this is Paige Lambermont of the Competitive Enterprise Institute and Travis Fisher of the Cato Institute. And they're going to help me unpack some of these challenges. So let's start with Paige. Paige, in the news, there have been a lot of kind of one-off deals between tech companies and nuclear power plants or some clean energy companies in some instances. Can you talk a little bit about some of these deals and what's behind them and driving this trend?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of deals between tech companies that are building data centers and power providers. And the brunt of these began with kind of nuclear co-location agreements. And a co-location agreement is basically, I'm going to build my data center next to your power plant or next to the power plant that you're building, and then I'm going to keep some of that power behind the meter before it goes to the broader grid so that it's utilized for whatever purpose at closer hand. You don't have as many transmission costs, and you kind of have more control over the reliability of your power in that setup. And so a lot of companies that are building new data centers are making deals with nuclear companies, with gas companies, to have power behind the meter and co-located. We've seen that with the restart of 3 Mile Island between Constellation and Microsoft. We've seen deals between Google and Kairos Power with the construction of small modular reactors. Meta has actually done something sort of different and put out a bidding process for 1 to 4 gigawatts of nuclear power to be delivered by mid-next decade. And they've kind of just decided to take bids on that. But that we've also now, even more recently, seen gas companies start to make some of the same deals. So a data center in Ohio is co-locating a 120 megawatt gas plant. And GE Vernova is partnering with a lot of different energy or a lot of different tech companies to make kind of similar behind the meter deals. And what all of these have in common is the desire by these companies to control their access to power. They understand that the utility industry is really slow moving and that the construction of new power to meet that demand as it comes isn't going to be enough. They have to make their own deals ahead of time. They have to incentivize companies to build power for them. And that, I think, is what's driving a lot of this, is the desire to have reliable power, especially nuclear and gas that are the most reliable, and to have them where you need it, when you need it, and in a co-location agreement that gives you the ability to access that power directly.
And how do you think FERC as a regulator is likely to treat these deals? I know there's been pushback against 1 or 2 recently.
Yeah, we've seen kind of an interesting turn from FERC. In November, a deal between Amazon and Talon Energy that would have increased the amount of power that a Talon Energy-owned Susquehanna nuclear power plant gave to an Amazon data center. That deal was rejected by FERC in a 2-1 ruling, and basically it was because it could pull from the broader grid. That's existing kind of power. It was being uprated, but there's still the existing power element is, I think, what's key. And so I think the big takeaway is that companies that want to do behind the meter deals are going to be best served by bringing new power to the table, building new power entirely, rather than taking from existing sources, even if you're uprating them, because that's going to get into the weeds with FERC in ways that probably companies aren't going to want to do.
Great, thank you. Travis, I know you just had a big report come out recently from Cato on Inflation Reduction Act and subsidies. Could you maybe talk about some of the lessons from that report and how these subsidies interact with some of the issues we're talking about?
Yeah, and I apologize up front if somebody has heard me go on a rant about the IRA. I think every time I speak, I'm like, well, have you guys looked at the IRA? What Cato decided to do was, because I thought the scoring was just not very accurate on the front end. So the budget scoring, this is from CBO with JCT, and the numbers I was seeing just didn't make sense to me based on what I knew about how the production tax credit works and all that stuff. So we basically did a bottom-up reanalysis so we basically did our own score. The takeaway is, over the 10-year scoring window coming up, we actually did a lower bound and an upper bound because it's so uncertain what the total amounts are going to be. Lower bound was about $1 trillion over the 10 years. Upper bound was more like $2 trillion. But the other thing that I really want to emphasize, and especially for the folks here on the Hill, is a lot of the tax credits are not capped in terms of total dollar amounts, and they are not limited by any time. They don't expire. And when I bring that up, almost everybody's like, yeah, well, they expire in 2032. A lot of them do. Some of them are tied to a greenhouse gas emissions level target. Level is interesting here because of the demand growth phenomenon. It's not an intensity. So you can green the grid in terms of CO2 per kilowatt hour, but you would still not be hitting that level threshold, which is 25% of 2022 emissions on the grid. So I view that threshold now in the context of demand growth, especially from AI. I view that threshold as impossible to meet. So those subsidies are, as the law exists now, it's wide open-ended. Our upper bound by 2050 was something like $4.7 trillion. Lower bound was in the low $2 trillion. Still, that's a significant amount of money, and you have to think about, in the context of a broader tax reform package, sort of how much can you pay for, how much other things, whether it be tax cuts or other sort of credits, or if you want to get into industrial policy, what else could you do with that money?
And I mean, is it primarily wind and solar developers getting the money? Is it electric vehicle subsidies?
It depends what gets built, and that's the tricky part about modeling this stuff and trying to do projections is, will we have a bunch of new offshore wind or none? Right now, it looks like none, and that was something that was hard to predict when we started the report, was before Trump was elected, and now we have, essentially a categorical offshore wind ban. So we'll see less of that, but perhaps more nuclear, especially if the federal government gets into that game. So pretty much everything that doesn't emit CO2 at the point of production is eligible for either production tax credit, investment tax credit. So we're going to see a lot, whether it's nuclear storage. I expect a significant amount of solar in our modeling, which is based on the lower bound is usually the EIA numbers. So Energy Information Administration does a projection out to 2050 and beyond. The National Renewable Energy Lab does a series of scenarios. They get really complicated with it. Usually our lower bound was the EIA numbers and our upper bound was the NREL numbers. And it looks like most of the subsidies are probably going to onshore wind and solar PV.
And real quick, what would you say to someone who says, well, we have all this AI, we have all this electricity demand coming from AI, we need more energy sources, so these subsidies are a good thing, we want more energy supply?
So there are a few reasons that the subsidies, I think, are really ineffective. The main one is the queues are already clogged, so there's already a long line to get on the grid. And so if all you do is throw extra subsidies at something, that's just more people getting in the line and not a whole lot of new stuff getting built. So whether we choose to focus on, other infrastructure expansions, transmission comes up a lot. There's a more targeted and I think smarter and more cost-effective way to do it than just subsidizing the generation itself. So no, I don't think it really answers that question. And in the Trump era of energy dominance, I don't think an industry that only thrives when you subsidize it, I don't think that's the definition of a dominant industry.
Paige, Travis mentioned nuclear power. I know that nuclear is now getting subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act. Could you talk a little bit about what role you see nuclear power playing in the coming years, as well as natural gas, which seems to be making somewhat of a comeback?
I think that nuclear will certainly have a big role to play in the coming years as AI power demand increases. And I think that the IRA subsidies for it are actually a huge problem. I think that when a technology starts to receive the same subsidies as a technology that's working less well, it sort of gets tied in with it. And I think that nuclear getting tied in with wind, solar, and other things that don't work quite as well isn't going to be good for it in the long term. Becoming reliant on government subsidies to operate isn't going to be good for it in the long term. And that the best option for anyone trying to build nuclear power plants or anyone continuing to operate one would actually be to remove all the subsidies from the equation entirely and allow it to function in a normally regulated market that doesn't have sort of the market distortions we're seeing now. I think that it's a mistake to think that IRA subsidies would help nuclear in the long term.
How about natural gas? What do you think the prospects are there?
Yeah, I think that natural gas and nuclear are both kind of natural choices to power data centers because they're both able to operate around the clock. And that's the kind of power that data centers need, right? They operate at the same output pretty much all the time, same consistent power demand. And nuclear power has an incredibly high capacity factor and operates around the clock. Gas can, it just doesn't, because right now it's used as a peaker plant usually to match the demand of other things on the grid, especially wind and solar. And so I think they both have that kind of ability to constantly provide power. The advantage for gas is that it's faster to build, right? If you're building a gas plant, that's going to take a few years, whereas a nuclear plant is going to take probably closer to a decade. And so it's sort of a short-term versus long-term issue. You know, if you want power in the long term, a nuclear plant is a good thing to go to. But in the short term, the gas plants get built quickly, so they have an advantage there.
And what policies do you think would help unlock more nuclear power and more natural gas? And I know that there was some NRC reforms that passed a year or so ago, and what was in that? Can we build on that?
Yeah, so the Advance Act last year had some provisions for streamlining advanced nuclear reactors that I think will be helpful as they're implemented. There's also sort of the Part 53 rulemaking coming up that'll change things like emergency planning zones for smaller nuclear reactors, and that'll be helpful. There's a lawsuit right now between Texas, Utah, and Last Energy versus the NRC to try to determine what size of a reactor essentially should qualify to be regulated by them. Right now they regulate everything, but there are some micro reactors that might in the future not be under NRC jurisdiction, depending on how that lawsuit goes. So I think all of those things could sort of help to improve, especially for small modular reactors, the level of overregulation that they're seeing from the NRC. I think that when it comes to gas, one of the most important things is like the reason that we haven't been building as many gas plants in recent years is the power plant rule. And as the future looks pretty dim for the power plant rule, it looks pretty bright for building new gas plants. I know that the GE Vernova 3-year wait time for gas turbines is invoked a lot to say like you can't build gas plants quickly. But the reason that they have a 3-year wait time is because everyone realized at the same time that they were able to build gas plants again and that they'd probably be able to keep those gas plants open. And so because of that, there's a huge increase in demand for gas plant components. And so companies like GE Vernova are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in capacity to put up new gas capacity. And so I think that in the future, we'll see much more gas built and gas built much more easily just because of those things. From a more legislative perspective, I think a lot of the advice contained in CEI's EPA blueprint will be really helpful. Changing the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act to be less restrictive for new projects, and things like NEPA reform are going to be huge, I think, in the construction of gas plants, as well as pipeline approvals, because there's no sense in building a gas plant if you can't get gas for it. So seeing more pipelines being built, more pipelines being approved so that they can get to the places that these power plants will be built, I think will be huge.
Great. Travis, I know you have some interesting ideas for how to overhaul the electricity grid, something called consumer regulated electricity markets. It's some idea that you've been pushing before the sessions today started. We were talking about FERC overhaul too. It seems like you had some ideas there. Could you just talk a little bit about maybe some more ambitious reforms that might be more long run about for reforming the electricity grid?
That's the Cato style. We're nothing if not ambitious. I think, well, I also want to pause and say that this is an excellent report. Encourage you all to read it. And I thank you for including the CRE concept in the report. I'm still trying to get traction with it. But the short version is at the state level, you could actually open up a window into what real competition might look like. And so what you would do is essentially, if you're islanded, if you're physically islanded, there's no need for the natural monopoly regulation that we've seen at the state level. So every state has a public utility commission, and usually it's in like a vertically integrated system where everything's regulated in terms of you need a certificate of public convenience and necessity is usually how it's characterized, or con law or something. So you have to get approval for the thing, then you get your rates capped, and it's all it's a regulatory, it's a bureaucratic process. There's very little innovation going on there. So what I've proposed is, if you want to see what innovation looks like, one way to do it is to explicitly make that setup legal so that you could have a power provider. You know, as Paige pointed out, this could be a company like Talon, I don't know. You have a power provider supplying either a single customer or a network of customers, but all in a physically islanded system. Then you'd be able to see what things look like when the regulator is not involved. And I think that would be a very interesting lesson to learn. And I'm not saying shift everything over into that model. So it's not radical in that sense, that it would just be sort of a foot in the door to see what is possible. And one analogy I like to point to, because we don't have this in the power grid. We don't really have an example of what flourishing, like radical innovation looks like. What I think it could look like is something like the existing utility system we have now is a lot like NASA. And it was fine. I mean, we got to the moon, did a lot of cool stuff. SpaceX, though, is just running laps around everything that NASA has ever done. The cost per, payload orbit, it's all they're doing just amazing things. So we need something like a SpaceX to what NASA was. We need something like that to the existing grid, because it really is a bureaucratic government exercise right now. And I'd like to see what it could be if we sort of unleashed it.
How about FERC? There could be some shakeups happening there, or?
Yeah, so I think for them it's going to be a little bit more boring, and I agree with Paige that if you buy into the bring your own power model, I think that's easier. But they still have to sort out the cost allocation issues for, say, are you using the transmission system if you're providing your own power? Are you not? Are you only using it occasionally? Do you get some sort of deep discount? Then you could go down the rabbit hole of ancillary services, like how much are you paying for Black Start and other things like that. So you're still using the grid and you should pay for that. But that's kind of a boring cost allocation question. One thing that I have noticed that FERC does is, when the questions are this difficult, and this one is a difficult question, what they do is they put the burden on somebody else. So what they've done is they've told PJM, show us how your tariff is just and reasonable given everything that's going on, instead of just giving an answer. I think everybody just wants an answer, a framework. At this point, it looks like it's up to PJM to file that framework, and we'll see where it goes.
Okay. There was a permitting bill that almost, I guess, came somewhat close to passing during the lame duck that Senator Manchin and Barrasso had introduced, and it got caught up in some of these cost allocation issues. It was largely a transmission bill, so it didn't necessarily make as many of the significant changes we'd like to see to, say, an act like NEPA. And so ultimately it didn't make it over the finish line. But I do think that the prospects for permitting reform seem to be better. I mean, you all might know better than me, but they're better than they've been in a long time. And I mean, there seems to be some growing bipartisan consensus, at least, that a lot of projects are getting held up by laws like NEPA. But I think we should also emphasize, and we talk about this in the report, that it's not just NEPA. NEPA is not the only statute. And the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, these all affect permitting. There's laws governing nuclear power, of course, and then there's the whole web of state laws and regulations, and many states have their own version of NEPA as well. And so ultimately, while the Trump administration is actually making some significant progress, the NEPA implementing regulations that have been in place for 40 years are being repealed as we speak. So there's a lot of hope, I think, right now, and optimism that we could be seeing some big progress. But ultimately, I think Congress is going to have to step in and take action if we're going to really see meaningful improvement to a statute like NEPA or any of these statutes. I mean, NEPA is still the law of the land, regardless of what happens on the regulatory end. And so those requirements are going to do that. Those environmental reviews, which have been taking so long and adding so much to costs, are going to continue. So cautiously optimistic, but I'd love to hear your perspective as well. Thanks, everyone, for attending. And please stay engaged with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Take a copy of our report. Modernizing the EPA is also the book available on our website. Thanks again.
Thank you.